Why hello everybody, it's Emma here, the Bookish Princess. I hope you've all been having a lovely day. It's the start of a new month and that means I've got a reading wrap up. I've got my stack of books here, everything I've been reading in the month of March and what I'm planning to read in the month of April. Pretty good stack here. I feel like I could get a workout right now. But I did have a couple of ebooks as well. The first ebook that I wanted to tell you about, my mom actually recommended. It's called Perfume from Provence. It's by Lady Winifred Fortescue. This is nonfiction. It's kind of a memoir, recollections. Lady Fortescue is an English woman who moved to Provence in France, and it's all about her life there, getting their house set up, all the construction, dealing with the construction workers, all of their neighbors, their garden. It is just so charming. Her writing really brings the countryside to life, the people, the villages. She includes so many interesting, funny little details. I love her humor. It really is like a little trip to Provence. Her garden sounds absolutely glorious, that just everything seems to grow there, and I love how she talks about like the wildflowers that the natives just like will walk over and not even pay attention to, but she, you know, having lived in England and knowing that in England she would have had to pay, you know, pretty expensive prices to import those bulbs from Holland and then carefully watch them to try to make them grow, whereas in Provence they just grow on the sides of the roads. There isn't really an overarching plot, but all the vignettes come together so beautifully, and each one is so lovely. I loved her descriptions of the saint days, especially with Easter just this past weekend. It was really lovely to read about all the different saints they celebrate and all the different ways they celebrate them. She talks about traveling to visit a chapel for a certain saint and how behind the chapel, kind of in this rocky nook, there was a really beautifully carved crucifix with Christ, and it was such a lonely spot that she didn't want to leave him by himself there. Just the little touches of her faith, which are really beautiful. The cast of characters, her gardener, Hilaire, her housekeeper, Amelia, is also fantastic. At one point she talks about the cypress trees and how every house would plant 2 cypress trees, one for peace and one for prosperity. And I just thought that was so cool because I feel like in Provence and in Italy you see a lot of cypress trees, so I wonder if that's maybe a widespread tradition. I think she named her trees La Paix and La Prosperity, I can't remember, but her peace tree was not doing so well, and her garden was like, ah, madame, peace never flourishes in this world. The absolutely lovely thing about this book is that there are more books. My mom has been reading some of the sequels, so I can't wait to get to those. It's always a bummer when you discover like a lovely author or like a really lovely book and they only have that one book. When there are more books to read, you have such a treat in store. I also did get to The Lost Princess by George MacDonald. This was the first George MacDonald book that I'd ever read. I realized it's not Gilead. I thought that might have been where I heard about him, although I kind of feel like he maybe was mentioned in Gilead too, but C.S. Lewis. This was very influenced by George MacDonald, so I have a feeling that's where I first heard his name. It was really cool getting acquainted with him. He wrote many Christian children's books. The Curdie stories, I think, were also pretty popular, and J.R.R. Tolkien loved those. The orcs were kind of inspired by the goblins in those stories. The Lost Princess was pretty short. I picked it up on Kindle. It was probably like $1. When I first started it, I was a little worried it was gonna be kind of flowery. The book starts with like a 1.5-page description of this golden rain, which, hey, don't get me wrong, I love poetic, beautiful descriptions, but maybe not 2 pages of them. However, I'm very happy to say that that did not continue. There was, of course, a moral to the story. It actually reminded me a lot of the fairy tales from The Women Who Run with the Wolves book by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. I read that last year and absolutely loved it. That book is like a series of different fairy tales and myths about this wild woman archetype. The author tells each myth and then kind of picks it apart. But there were moments of this that were very otherworldly and strange and interesting, and it totally read like something out of the Wild Woman book. The Wise Woman is the name of the kind of magical central figure kind of driving everything in this book, and I won't tell you too much of the plot because I don't want to give anything away, but I ended up really enjoying it, and it definitely makes me want to read more George MacDonald. This next book I'm only a couple pages into, but I'm definitely excited to get to the rest of it. It is A Brief History of Time by Stephen Hawking. I'm actually reading this with some of my college friends for a kind of book discussion group. Of course, Stephen Hawking recently passed away, and we actually picked it before he passed away, but now it especially seems very timely to read. I I don't think I've ever read anything by Stephen Hawking before, so definitely excited to get to this. I love it when some of my books kind of tie together, and speaking of C.S. Lewis being influenced by George MacDonald, I did read some C.S. Lewis. I also read some Tolkien, which you'll hear about in just a sec. Anyway, this was a reread for me. The Screwtape Letters I've read at least several times before, but every time I come back to it, there's something that I didn't notice. So many clever, funny situations. It really makes you realize that evil isn't always this like black, sinister thing. It's often this very everyday, kind of mundane impatience and unkindness, and just apathy to the people around us. The premise of this is that a senior devil named Screwtape is writing to his nephew Wormwood, who is a tempter in the world, who is trying to corrupt the soul of a man who lives in England, you can tell, and this is set during one of the World Wars, so you know, you hear a little bit about the World War. The devils, of course, aren't so much concerned with the war as they are with the state of this man's soul. I'm sure I'll do a blog post with some of my favorite quotations over on my blog, A Pinch of Pixie Dust. So if you want to hear some of my favorite quotations, make sure you hop over there. There were so many of them in the Screwtape Letters. So speaking of C.S. Lewis, I also was reading some of his friend Tolkien. I've been on kind of a Tolkien kick. I reread The Hobbit this month, which was my final reread. You can see my set right here of Lord of the Rings, so I felt like I had to reread The Hobbit to kind of finish it out. This is definitely a different flavor from The Lord of the Rings because it is written more as a children's book, but it is equally charming and wonderful, and the characters, the dwarves, are so fantastic, and their adventures, the dragon, oh my gosh. There were so many quotes from this that I loved too. Each stage of their quest brings new characters and new adventures and new creatures. Just so fascinating and fun to read. Especially fun to read because I also read J.R.R. Tolkien, the authorized biography. This is by Humphrey Carpenter. So it was absolutely fascinating, having just finished The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, to then read about how they all came about and all the different influences like George MacDonald and C.S. Lewis, his friend. Nonfiction is always a little tricky for me, especially biographies, because so often the author, the biographer, like doesn't just tell you the facts, they like interpret them for you. And especially in a biography, like I'd rather not get your opinion. I'd rather you just tell me how it happened and then leave it to the reader to kind of interpret that in their own way. This author was definitely very cynical at times. Tolkien worked in Oxford. He was a professor at Oxford for about 30 years. He was an accomplished philologist, so he knew everything about language. It's so cool to hear about Lord of the Rings because the way that developed, first, what Tolkien did was he created his own language because he loved languages so much. But then he realized that every language needs a history to go with it. So for his invented fictional language, he started inventing a fictional history. He worked so hard to make sure everything fit in that kind of invented world. He just wanted the world to be true to itself, almost as if it had already been invented somewhere else and he was just kind of collecting the details and retelling them. Anyway, The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings kind of evolved slowly, and for a long time he'd worked as a professor at Oxford. And this author seems to think that working as a professor at Oxford for 30 years was so drab and so boring. I don't know if he wanted something more exciting to be able to write about. Excuse me, living and working in Oxford? I don't see anything trivial or boring about that. Like, you don't need to apologize that that's not interesting enough. I think that's fascinating. It was so fun too to listen to how The Lord of the Rings kind of gradually took off and became so popular. This is one of my dad's many Tolkien books, which is why I picked it up, but just super enjoyed it. Now that I'm thinking about it, I realize I had quite a bit of nonfiction this month with Perfume from Provence and the Tolkien biography, also this one, A Life in Letters. This is The Letters of P.G. Woodhouse. It's edited by Sophie Radcliffe. I really liked the format of this because first Sophie Radcliffe would write like a little short chapter about like what P.G. Woodhouse was doing in that time in his life, and then you would read a whole bunch of his own letters. So it gave you a really great context, but then you still got to read his own words and his own letters. Lots of the typical Woodhouse humor. I loved his letters to his stepdaughter, Snorky is what he called her. Leonora was her name, and unfortunately she died during World War II, and she was only, you know, in her 30s, and that really, P.G. Woodhouse and his wife, that really affected them. Cool to hear about all of his involvement with the movies and with different Broadway shows. He's constantly going from New York to Paris to England. Also, I loved hearing what he thinks about other authors. One of the people he corresponds with was, I think, Angela Thirkle's brother, and apparently the brother didn't like Angela Thirkle very much. And at one point, P.G. Woodhouse says, well, I tried not to like her because I know you don't, but I couldn't help being swept away. I really enjoyed getting to know P.G. Woodhouse a little better. He's one of my favorite authors. So of course I had to go and read some P.G. Woodhouse after that. This is Mulliner Nights. I really love the Mulliner stories. This probably isn't my favorite. I think the one with Buck You Up-O is my favorite. Is that Mr. Mulliner speaking? One of those. I'll link these books down in the description, by the way, and I'll find the one with Buck You Up-O. This actually has a little sequel to Buck You Up-O, which is pretty great. Also, a number of short stories concerning cats. Oh my gosh, just no one does it better than P.G. Woodhouse. If you need a kind of lighthearted, very funny escape, he's the one to go to. So I recently filmed a Penguin English Library collection. I went through all of the Penguin English libraries on my shelf. This is one that I haven't reread yet. I need to break it in. So I actually have started it. It's Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. I'm probably only about 20 pages in, but already our hero has run away from home, got trapped in a terrible storm out on the ocean, miraculously was saved, but decides not to go back home, instead goes back to sea, gets captured by pirates, and now has just escaped. If you like seafaring tales of adventure, this is definitely a good one. So Easter was just this past Sunday. I was reading this during March leading up to it. This is She Who Believed. It's a Lenten devotional by Blessed Is She. Blessed Is She, I think they publish Bibles, they publish kind of weekly calendars, and they also do these seasonal devotionals for Advent and Lent. I'd never tried one before, but I'm absolutely so glad I did. So you have different readings about different women from the Bible every day, and then of course a spot to respond and reflect. So many of these women I had never really stopped to think about before. Many of them we don't even get to hear their name, but they're very important women in the Gospels. It was really cool to stop and reflect on, okay, I don't know her name, but she had a whole life and a whole story, and what was that like, and what was her encounter with Christ like? There were a number of women who I'd never even heard of before. Sarah from the book of Tobit, and also Judith, both are from the Old Testament. All of these are kind of short Bible readings, but after reading about those two, I had to get out my Bible and read the entire book of Tobit and the book of Judith. And both were just so cool, really great reading for Lent, or really any time of the year. Anyway, I'm so glad I had this devotional to see me through Lent. So these are just two small books that I came across on my shelves recently and was realizing I haven't read them in a while. They might be fun reading for spring. This is Shakespeare's Sonnets. I know there are a number that are just really excellent for spring. You can never go wrong with some Shakespeare, so I thought that would be fun. Also, I have here Emily Dickinson's Letters. This is just such a beautiful Everyman's Library Pocket Poets edition. This is actually what first got me hooked on Emily Dickinson, because I feel like her poems are kind of hard to come at. Like, her lines are so not the way you would expect sentences to be structured. So reading her letters, which are written in, you know, more conventional sentences, was a really lovely way to kind of see her style and see her thought process. This definitely made me want to go and read more of her poetry, which I've now absolutely love her poetry. It's been a long time since I revisited the letters. You get these beautiful sketches on the dust jacket there. So those are my books for the month of March. Definitely looking forward to April. I hope you guys have had a great reading month as well. I'd love to hear about what you've been reading down in the comments if you have any recommendations. Before we sign off, I have to real quick tell you about this adorable sweatshirt. How perfect! Avid Readers Club. This is by a brand called Joni Clothing. They do adorable dresses and also really funny, quirky, you know, kind of graphic design shirts as well. Anyway, thank you so much to Joni Clothing. They were kind enough to send me this and a couple dresses. I'm sure you'll be seeing the dresses in future videos as well. So I'll leave it linked down below if you want to check it out. That's about it from me. Until next time, I hope you guys have a magical and a bookish day. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye!